Hey y'all, it's me, Cindy Fessler, your fellow Christian warrior, here to help you know more so you can share more and grow more of God's kingdom. So, if y'all haven't already done this, you know what to do. Please make sure to smack that bell and subscribe button so that more people can see this video. More Christians can know how to share their faith with others. Thanks so much. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about oral transmissions in ancient Near East cultures. So this is from Josh McDowell's book on evidence that demands a verdict. Very good book. Highly recommend it if you're going to be an apologist. So embedded in the scholarship of much of contemporary biblical criticism is a reliance on the false presuppositions made in the 19th and early 20th century biblical scholars who failed to account properly for the primacy and authority of orality over textually intrinsic to the ancient Near East cultures that they were attempting to understand. So they just made these comments. They didn't really understand the culture. So Schneewind, who is a German scholar, critiques the worldview that produced these mistaken ideas. Let's see what he has to say. So such documentary theories begin with a worldview of textual culture. So we are a textual culture. We have things that are written down, whether they're in digital form or in a book and so forth. We have a textual culture. The ancient Near East cultures did not. It was different. So that's it. That's that they begin with the worldview of modern critics. Okay, they look at it through the eyes of what we have now, not ancient cultures. Ancient cultures were different. Some scholars have pointed out that the oral world of the early Israel hardly suits a complex documentary approach to the literature of Israel. Israel's traditions, they argue, were largely transmitted orally, like the epics of Homer. Homer being, obviously a famous ancient book. Widespread literacy is a relatively modern phenomenon. Ancient Israel was primarily an oral culture. Orally composed literature should not be characterized as rustic or unsophisticated. Works such as Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey serve as prime examples of the power, complexity, and sophistication that oral literature can possess. Oral compositions can be complex, written text can be simple. Moreover, even when we begin to have written texts, the oral world leaves its mark on them, the scholar who's saying this. So primacy of old traditions. What's the primacy of these oral traditions? John Walton, professor of Old Testament at Wheaton College, provides a concise amount of the central role oral traditions played in ancient Israel. Let's take a look at what he says. Returning to the hearing dominant culture of the ancient world, it's at least clear that orality was valued over textuality in many cases, though it seems illogical to us, right? Because we write everything down. The ancients considered oral texts to be adequate means of composing and communicating literature, including acts of preserving and interpreting. Even those who had the ability to write, oral communication could be preferred in some cases. So that's Walton and Sandy write this. And as to the reason for the preferences of orality over textuality, Walton continues, textuality provided no means for relationship or discussion between teachers and students. Furthermore, reading a book might lead someone to think they had learned a body of material, but for them only to repeat what was written in a book considered an illusion of knowledge. Orality functions particularly well in communicating powerful messages to smaller groups of people. It was also written by Walton and Sandy. Okay, so the ability of these orators, who were these guys that orated the text or that orated the information back then? So Craig S. Keener, professor of New Testament at Ashbury Theological Seminary, demonstrates the capacity of ancient Greco-Roman orators to memorize and recite large amounts of information. Let's see what he says. Some schools were known for practicing diligent training of their memories. The Pythagoreans reportedly could not rise from bed in the morning until they had recited their previous day's works. Difficult as it may seem to most readers today, the elder Seneca testifies, this elder Seneca testifies that in his younger days, he could repeat 2,000 names in exactly the sequence in which he had just heard them, or recite up to 200 verses given to him in reverse. So this is Seneca was able to do this. Even if his recollections of youthful prowess are exaggerated, they testify to an emphasis on memory that far exceeds standard expectations today. Seneca also reports that another man, hearing a poem recited by its author, recited it back to the author verbatim. facetiously claiming the poem to be his own, and that the famous Hortensius listed every purchaser and price of the end of a long day at auction, his accuracy attested to by the bankers. And obviously, the bankers would have a vested interest in knowing it's right. So these are all things stated by Seneca, speaking about other folks that could do these certain things. Just want to be clear on that. In addition, Keener alludes to the higher degree of accuracy with which orators might have transmitted their narratives as compared with their scribal counterparts. So the guys that could speak it were much better than the guys that could write it. In the circle of trained storytellers and sages, memories may preserve information accurately from one generation to the next. Indeed, oral tradition might invite less redaction than written sources would. Folklorists have shown that some communities transmit traditions faithfully with the minimal modifications. Storytellers create and vary within the constraints of community tradition. Some suggest that writers were far more likely to introduce substantial changes. So the writers were making changes. The guys that just were reciting the stories were different. So even though we're talking about storytellers and folklorists here, we're not talking about that when it comes to the Bible. This is just talking about oral tradition in general. Even today, in our highly textualized culture, we often experience the power of orally transmitted material, our own capacity accurately to retain material we have learned from oral sources. Walton illustrates this phenomenon. Let's see what Walton has to say. People in churches today who are raised on hymns recognize immediately when even a single word has been changed, whether for updating language or gender-inclusive inclinations. In a chapel service yesterday, we sang a hymn that I probably had not sung or heard in decades. In the fourth verse, a line was changed, and it immediately caught my attention. Our ears can be very demanding about the precise transmission of treasured traditions, and that would have been even more the case in a society in which oral transmission of tradition was the norm. This evidence about the power and validity of oral memory and the capacity of orators in the biblical era to transmit oral material accurately establishes a trustworthy foundation upon which the biblical text was built. Authority of the spoken word. Scheinelwind, scholar again, shows that it was not necessarily the identity of the author of a biblical text that establishes authority over community, but the oral presentation of traditional historical narratives and religious laws. Through such songs, stories, and powerful sayings and traditions of the mothers and fathers were passed along to their sons and daughters. Even the Torah itself was primarily given orally to Israel, although it would come to be written down text above all others. The earliest account of the giving of 10 commandments in Exodus 19 through 20 actually never mentions writing the commandments down. This glaring omission points to the antiquity of this account of the Sinai tradition because it reflects time before books were central to the Jewish culture. The fundamental orality of early Israel is reflected in the genre of many of their society's primary texts. One example in biblical literature is the prophetic messenger formula. Thus says in the book. In the Bible, the phrase becomes a set of written formula, but it has its setting in the oral delivery of passages or messages. Thus, even when we have written text, the oral word often pervades their written expression. So these things were said a certain way, and so they wrote them down a certain way. Scheinwind, that's from the author Scheinwind. Having established an overall reliability of oral transmission, we can now posit a reliable transmission of biblical material from the occurrence of the events to their later textualization in written form. How cool is that? Well, hey guys, thanks so much for watching this video. I am so excited that you stuck to it to the end, and I appreciate that. And please do smack that subscribe button. Check out the next video.